Welcome everybody, and thank you again for joining us for today's webinar, Optimizing Color in Photoshop. I'm Tim Gray, and I'm going to take you through a variety of techniques and tricks and tips in Photoshop to help you truly optimize the color in your photographs. First, I want to thank x-rite for hosting me for this webinar. Always great to be with x-rite. And of course, whenever I think of x-rite, I'm always thinking about color management, and making sure that I'm getting the best results in terms of the images I'm working on, what I see on my display, and one of the most important things, I don't hear a lot of photographers talking about monitor calibration. I'm going to show you sort of a visual example, if you will, of the importance of monitor calibration. But in the meantime, I want to mention that there are a couple of specials. Hunts Photo is sponsoring today's webinar, and they have a couple of discounts that are available to webinar attendees. These discounts are good through the end of February. And first off is Color Monkey Display. This is a monitor calibration package. It does a great job of making sure that the colors on your display are accurate so that you're evaluating your images accurately, and more importantly, in my mind, that you're optimizing your photos more accurately. And so if you go to the Hunts website and put in 30MUNKI, 30 Monkey, you'll get $30 off the Color Monkey Display package. And then also, if you want to make sure that you've got absolutely perfect color in the original capture, this is especially critical for product photographers, for example, but it's also tremendously helpful for portrait photographers and even for landscape and other types of photography. The Color Checker Passport, you can get $15 off at Hunts Photo and Video by using the promo code 15PASS. So be sure to check those out. We will paste the links to those discounts directly so that you can just follow the link and get the discount automatically without having to type in a code. Those are being pasted into the chat, so you can check that out. Along the way, during the webinar today, if you have questions related to any of the topics that I'm talking about when it comes to optimizing color for your images in Photoshop, please feel free to put those into the questions chat, and we'll sort through those, and I'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. So let's dive right in. I want to take a look first at some concepts, and so I'm going to simulate a process here, simulate the importance of display calibration, of making sure that your display is showing you accurate colors. Because if you're not seeing accurate colors on the display, then any of the adjustments that you apply are not really giving you the result that you think that you are getting. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's assume that this is how the image came out of my camera. Now I'm in Photoshop. I'm ready to optimize the color in this image. I have not yet calibrated my monitor display, but I figure it's probably not that important. And so I go to color balance, for example, and I find that I'm able to do a surprisingly good job of optimizing the color in this photo. Just a couple of sliders for color balance, and the color is dramatically improved. Then I attend a Tim Gray webinar and find out just how important it is to calibrate my display. And then I calibrate my display, and things start to look like this. And of course, I immediately assume it must be something wrong with my calibration package, that I did not get a good result with the calibration. But no, in fact, it's that now I'm getting an accurate picture of my image, now that I've optimized my display. Now, obviously, maybe it's not totally obvious, but it's pretty obvious, I think, that in this case I was wildly exaggerating the situation. Generally speaking, in terms of color at least, when you calibrate your display, the difference between before and after is going to be relatively subtle. The color with most modern displays, most current displays, is actually pretty accurate right out of the box. What's generally not accurate is the brightness, however. We're generally, I would say, a typical display that you purchase, an LCD display, for example, the default settings cause it to be about twice as bright as it really should be for optimizing your photos. A full stop too bright, essentially. So with color, it's going to generally be a relatively modest shift, at least with a reasonably new display, but the brightness values are going to be significant. So very important to calibrate your display. And again, the Color Monkey package, the Color Monkey display package, is an excellent tool for that purpose. And again, be sure to take advantage of that discount offered by Hunts Video if you do not yet have a package for monitor calibration. So I want to show you some principles of color. We're going to be talking a lot about evaluating color and adjusting color and shifting colors around. But first, just a little primer as a reminder. I suspect this is not new to most of you, but just in terms of general concept, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as color. We know, of course, we're working with red, green, and blue colors as our primaries for our monitor displays as well as for our cameras. And in fact, for photo inkjet printing, even though we're using cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks and a few shades in between, the RGB, the printers, the photo inkjet printers, are actually behaving as RGB devices. You should treat them as an RGB device even though they're using CMYK colors. Well, let's take a look at the actual interaction of colors. We have red light at maximum intensity, green light at maximum intensity, blue light at maximum intensity, and we can combine those various lights. In this case, of course, we're using the idea of light to blend colors, but in fact, when we're working in Photoshop, we're thinking about sliders, but remember, it really is light. We're seeing light projected by our monitor display and how that light interacts. And so understanding the relationships between colors, understanding that cyan, magenta, and yellow, the subtractive primaries, are also created by combining other colors. And the more you understand the relationships between colors, the better you'll be at optimizing color in your photos. You'll understand which direction to shift, what sorts of colors are related to each other, and how they all interact, etc. So just having a basic understanding there can be very helpful. Just a quick look at the subtractive primaries, cyan, magenta, and yellow. Of course, in CMYK, we also have black key color, and that's simply because we're not able to produce a pure black when we combine all of those colors. So here we're actually reflecting the light. So we illuminate a print, for example, and it is the light that is reflecting back. These are referred to, CMYK is referred to as the subtractive primaries, because the colors themselves absorb some of the light that strikes them and only reflect back a portion of the light. And so we're essentially not seeing all of the light being reflected back. When we shine a white light on a print, not all of that light actually reflects back into our eye. Instead, it's just based on the pigments that are on the paper, for example. So in theory, we combine all three and we get pure black. In reality, we usually get kind of a muddy brown when we're talking about ink on paper. And so that's the reason that we need to add black ink, or one of the reasons anyway that we need to add black ink. But again, notice that our RGB primaries are also displayed here amongst these subtractive primaries. So all of these colors are all related to each other. They're all interacting in some way when we're working on our photos. And then this is a typical presentation in terms of how colors interact, what the relationships are between colors, describing it as a color wheel. And of course, in the real world, I would say that colors are not comprised of a wheel. They're wavelengths of light. There's a specific range of wavelengths that fall into the visible spectrum, the range of colors that we are able to actually see with our visual system. But for simplicity, we describe the color along a wheel. Generally speaking, if we're talking about color, what that really means is generally hue. What we think of as the color of an object, I think, would be in many respects more accurately referred to as the hue. Of course, saturation and brightness also come into play. But in terms of those actual colors, we could describe the hue as degrees around the color wheel, and we'll see some of that a little bit later today. But red is usually the starting point, so that's 0 degrees around the color wheel, and then cyan would be at 180, etc. So we can go around that color wheel and define colors based on the wheel. But more importantly, with this concept, using a color wheel to describe color, we now understand the relationships between colors. For example, that in the RGB color model, here's red at the top, green over at the lower left, and blue over at the bottom right. But we also have opposite colors. So cyan is opposite of red, and that means when we're applying a color shift, we're shifting between red and cyan. Well, that's based on the RGB color model, where we can shift between red and cyan, between green and magenta, and between blue and yellow. So we're shifting between the primary colors, the additive and subtractive primary colors. But that's only really with the RGB color model. We could define all sorts of other potential color models, and in fact today we're going to see the lab color model, not by working directly in lab per se, but some of our adjustments are actually based on lab color. And with lab color, we have L, A, and B as our channels. L for luminance, and then the A and B channels, which are our blue and yellow shift, that would be our color temperature, and our green magenta shift, which would be our tint. And so when we're using the typical white balance adjustments, we're actually, even if we don't know it, we're working in a lab color space. We're working based on the primaries for the lab color model. And again, just understanding how colors interact with each other so that you can better anticipate what sorts of adjustments you're going to want to apply to an image can be tremendously helpful. Now, we also have a concept called memory colors. And put simply, memory colors, what this really means is that there are certain objects that you know the inherent color of. I would venture to guess that everyone attending the webinar can picture in their mind the precise shade of yellow of a perfectly ripe banana, as well as the shade of green for an unripe banana, and the shade of brown for an over-ripened banana. Of course, your choices about how much is a perfectly ripened banana, that might vary for each of you, but regardless, you can picture in your mind that perfect color just based on your own experience in the world. And so a reference chart, something like this, can be very helpful. An image that contains memory colors, for many photographers, having people as part of that can be very helpful, because skin tones, getting skin tones accurate can be tremendously important. And the same goes for other objects, obviously, in the real world. So a yellow flower, for example, brown leather. The point is that when you have a sample image like this, where you can examine the quality of the colors on your monitor display, you can make a print and evaluate the accuracy of that print. That can be very helpful. Those memory colors come in handy. And also, whenever you're working on a photo where you have an object that is a well-known object, number one, that makes it a little bit easier for you to actually apply those adjustments to determine when you've achieved good results or accurate results in terms of the color. But also, it's important to keep in mind that when you're adjusting an image that contains a well-known subject, something considered a memory color object, your viewers, the viewers of your photo, are going to be using, even if they don't realize it, they're going to be using their memory of those colors to determine whether or not the colors are accurate. So accurate color can be very important. Obviously, in some cases, we have some a poetic license, you might say, some artistic license that we can take, but the bottom line is that we want to make sure that the colors are as accurate as possible. Now, in order to choose or to determine whether or not the colors are accurate, of course, we need to be able to evaluate the colors in our images. Inside of Photoshop, there's a couple of things that I recommend in terms of evaluating color. The first thing I think is really, before you even start evaluating color, is to recognize that when it comes to color, our eyes can be fooled a little bit by the colors around it, by what we've been looking at, by how bright the room is, etc. And so again, that monitor calibration can be very important to help make sure that you're getting a good result, an accurate result on your display. But then the question is, is the color in the image really accurate? So if you look at this photo right now, for example, a little headshot, a portrait, if you will, of a bird, and then the question is, are the colors accurate? You might say, oh yes, the colors look to be accurate, the sky looks to be an appropriate shade of blue, but how do we actually choose whether or not the adjustment was good? Well, in the case of using adjustment layers, which I'll show you a little bit later, in mere moments, we'll take a look at some adjustment layers. But if I turn off the visibility for that adjustment layer, just by clicking the eye icon, so on the layers panel, we can take a look at the eye icon to the left of any given layer and turn off the visibility for that layer. And so here's the before by turning off the adjustment layer's visibility, and then turning the adjustment layer back on, here's the after. And it's a relatively subtle shift, but I suspect that you're able to see that with this adjustment applied, the white feathers, for example, are a little bit too red. And the sky, the color is not quite perfect. When we turn off the adjustment, things actually start to look a little bit better. And so just turning off an adjustment and turning it back on again can be tremendously helpful in evaluating the overall color in your image. Essentially evaluating your results, evaluating the job you did optimizing the color or adjusting the color in the image. Another trick that I like to use is to crank up the saturation. Now, I know some photographers really love to crank up the saturation regardless, but boosting the saturation to its maximum value can also be helpful for purposes of evaluating what colors are in the image. And in particular, when I'm using this technique, I'm looking at which colors I'm surprised by, which colors did I not expect to see in the image. So I'm going to click on the Add a New Adjustment Layer button at the bottom of the Layers panel. That's the half black, half white circle icon We'll see that again several times throughout this webinar. And I'm going to choose hue saturation. That will add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and then I can crank up that saturation to its maximum value. Now the funny thing here is, or what you might find funny, is that the yellow flowers don't seem to change at all. And that's because those yellows were very, very saturated to begin with, and so we're not seeing much there at all. The sky, obviously, not a big surprise. We see lots and lots of blue, but I am a little bit surprised to see a lot of magenta and red in the sky. If I bring that adjustment back down a little bit or turn off the adjustment, it starts to make more sense. I can see this was a late afternoon light shot. I've got some colors starting to show up. We're getting close to sunset, and we're seeing some colors up in the sky, and the clouds in the sky. And so then the question is, well, what do I do with this information? Now that I know that there is some red and magenta, a little bit of orange up in the sky, what do I do with that information? Well, I just keep in mind that those colors are there. If they're problematic colors, maybe I tone them down. If they're pleasing colors, maybe I boost them up a little bit. But mostly, I just want to be aware which colors exist in which areas of the photo. For example, if you're looking closely, you might see that we have a little bit of color fringing around the outer edges of some of these flowers. Maybe that's chromatic aberration, maybe it's just light reflected off of that beautiful sky. Whatever the case might be, I want to be aware of those colors, because if I crank up the saturation a little bit, those colors might start to become visible. So again, just by boosting the saturation to its maximum value, we can get a better sense of what colors exist within the image. Moving right along, I'm actually going to open up several images all at once because I want to talk about color in the context of raw captures. When we're using a raw capture mode on our cameras, the color setting, the white balance setting on the camera, does not impact the actual values that are being recorded by your camera. It does not affect the actual pixel values. I know it looks like it affects those pixel values. Here are various settings. This is with the camera set to tungsten, for example, obviously not the actual lighting conditions. And here is with fluorescent. So we can pick and choose which one seems to be the most accurate. I suspect that the daylight option might be the most accurate, obviously. But the point is that these settings are merely settings. These are just metadata values. When we set white balance in the camera for a raw capture, we are merely setting a metadata value that will become the default setting. So if I use the As Shot option in Adobe Camera Raw, I will see the color as the camera interpreted that color. And so I can actually then fine-tune things, but the As Shot setting is merely what the camera did. I could have set the camera to tungsten, and the colors would look pretty weird, pretty unusual, but I can still change the color to, for example, daylight, or just shift the temperature and tint sliders, and I end up with accurate color with no degradation of image quality. There's no penalty. And what that boils down to is that when it comes to achieving accurate color, it doesn't actually matter what your camera is set to in terms of the white balance setting if you are using raw capture. That said, I'm sure you can appreciate there's a clear convenience benefit in terms of having the color as accurate as possible when you capture the image in the first place. But for all of these images, I could change the temperature and tint. I'll just change all of these to daylight, for example, and you can see that every single raw capture here then gets the exact same color result, and again, with no penalty in terms of image quality. So it's something to be aware of in terms of raw capture. It's one more reason that raw capture can be beneficial for you in terms of your captures, but also then we need to consider that if you're shooting JPEG, number one, that's going to be problematic. You need to make sure that the colors are as accurate as possible in the original capture. But it's also important to realize that there is a workflow advantage, or at least a potential workflow advantage, to having the color as accurate as possible in the initial capture, just to save you work when processing the color later. In terms of that color, though, I find that a lot of photographers, especially when it's temperature and tint, remember that's just the lab color model, as we saw a few minutes ago, a lot of photographers sort of struggle with I don't have a good eye for color, how do I find the right settings, I don't know what a temperature is. Well, one of the things that I recommend, both in terms of better adjusting the color and developing a little bit of a better sense for color, is to swing the temperature and the tint sliders when you're adjusting temperature and tint. And in fact, for any adjustment that relates to color, it can be helpful. Swing through those extremes. So you see this is obviously far too yellow. This is way too warm, not good color. Going in the other direction, this is far too cool, and not in a good way. The color is just way too blue. And as I go through those extremes, this is not good, this is not good, and as I gradually kind of settle down to a good value, then I can start swinging that slider less and less and zero in on what seems to be just the right color. Do the same thing for tint, except for tint I actually don't need as much of an adjustment to have a strong impact on the image. Right about there looks to be pretty good. And then another handy trick, this works across the board in Lightroom, Adobe Camera Raw, and Photoshop. Any of the values that we're adjusting, I might be moving a slider, but I'm actually changing a numeric value. If you want to use your keyboard to have a little bit more control, to make it a little bit easier to shift those values, you can simply click your mouse into the field, into the value that you want to change, and then use the up arrow key to increase the value, the up arrow key on your keyboard, or the down arrow key to decrease the value. So in this case, up arrow to shift toward yellow, down arrow to shift toward blue. And if you add the shift key, if I hold the shift key while pressing up arrow, then I make a bigger shift, in this case toward yellow with the up arrow, or a bigger shift toward blue with the down arrow. And the same thing works for all of these various sliders and values, again, with Adobe Camera Raw, Photoshop, and Lightroom. In all of those situations, all of those cases, you can use that keyboard shortcut trick. Generally, the shift key, by the way, will increase or decrease by a factor of 10. With color temperature, it's a little bit of a different scale, but the same concept applies. So once you've got the color pretty accurate in terms of original raw capture, fine-tuning the temperature and tint in Adobe Camera Raw, in the case of working in Photoshop, if you've opened up that raw capture, then we can move on to the color balance setting. I'm just going to close those images, and we'll take a look at the color balance. And theoretically, at this point, I don't need to adjust the color balance for my image, because in concept, the color would be perfectly fine based on my adjustments with a raw capture in Adobe Camera Raw. So in theory, I don't really need to use a color balance adjustment, but I imagine many of you, like me, have found that sometimes you start working with an image, maybe you open up the shadow details a little bit, and you find that you actually do need to fine-tune the color a little bit more. And so for that, I use a color balance adjustment as my primary tool for adjusting the balance of colors, shifting the colors in one direction or the other. And again, memory colors can be helpful, but also memory colors, when you have a situation like this with objects that most people are probably familiar with, then it becomes even more important to make sure that you have accurate color. So let's go ahead and add a color balance adjustment. I'll go to the bottom of the layers panel, and I will click on that half black, half white circle icon, the Add Adjustment Layer button. That will bring up a list of the available types of adjustment layers. And so in this case, I'm going to use color balance, and so I'll just choose color balance from that pop-up. That will add a color balance adjustment layer on the layers panel. And then if I go down to my properties panel, I have the available adjustment controls. So first, let's take a look at this preserve luminosity checkbox. If that option is turned on, what happens is as I'm applying an adjustment to any of the sliders, the actual underlying value for the other colors will also be changed in order to preserve the perceived luminosity of the image. Now, generally speaking, I would say it doesn't really matter if this option is turned on or not, because regardless, you're going to apply a variety of different adjustments and you'll fine-tune the image as needed. But conceptually, I prefer to have preserve luminosity turned on. But remember, with preserve luminosity turned on, we're getting a variable effect in our image. In other words, when I move one slider, it's like I'm moving other sliders at the same time. And so if you're trying to achieve a perfectly neutral gray value in the image, having this option turned on can actually be a little bit frustrating, because as you shift to correct for a yellow color cast, suddenly more of a green cast comes in that wasn't there in the first place. So if you're trying to get a perfectly neutral value with color balance, then you might want to turn off the preserve luminosity checkbox, but in general, I leave it turned on. In terms of the sliders, what I recommend is that you start with the most important slider based on what is the color problem in the image. To me, this image just looks a little bit too yellow. It was illuminated by primarily incandescent lights, and there's still, to me, just a little bit too much yellow. And so I would start off with the blue slider, with the yellow-blue value, shifting, in this case, toward blue, away from yellow. So if I go toward yellow, you see that that yellow light becomes even stronger. And if I shift away toward blue, then the light starts to go away. And then we introduce some blue light sources into the image as well. So just as we saw before, swinging through the extremes a little bit can be helpful in terms of fine tuning. Now, I should hasten to add that when it comes to color, there's this sort of range of accurate colors, but then there's this creative license as well that you can exercise. So I would suggest that the color that we're seeing right now, shifting toward blue a little bit, that has actually made the color more accurate. But maybe you're not exactly looking for accurate, you're looking for beautiful. And so you might want to shift the colors a little bit toward yellow so that you're bringing out more of the natural yellow tones and the oranges and the bananas and the grapes, but also that you're getting just a warmer, more pleasing light. If you took a photograph at high noon, you might want to shift that balance a little toward yellow so it looks like you got there at late afternoon light rather than high noon. I'm not suggesting that you be dishonest with the viewers of your photos, but the point is that you do have some license in terms of how you're going to interpret the photo, how you're going to interpret the colors. But the idea is to essentially understand the color adjustments so that you can achieve the result you're after. And what I generally recommend is that you try to get the color as close to perfectly accurate as possible and then introduce the creative effect. So, for example, maybe bring these colors over to about there for the yellow-blue slider until the colors look accurate, and then say, yes, but I want a little bit of that golden light to be added back into the image. In this case, the blue-yellow was my biggest issue, but I still want to take a look at the other sliders, and in fact, my personal preference is to always touch all three of these sliders, and often multiple times, going through and just evaluating, do I want to shift toward red? Okay, obviously not. Do I want to take things way toward cyan? No, not a chance. But maybe just a little bit of a shift toward cyan might actually be helpful, and in this case, actually, I think it is. The green magenta slider then, and notice I'm going in whatever order I like. Basically, I'm going in the order of what color seems to be an issue for the photo. The green magenta doesn't seem to be significant in this case. I'll leave that at its neutral value, and then I can revisit in any order. I'll make sure that I'm adjusting all three of these sliders, sometimes putting it back to a value of 0 for a given slider, and then going back and fine-tuning the other sliders, just going through and adjusting all of them until I feel that I've achieved a really good result. And I think I'm going to take that yellow out of the image a little bit more. Right about there, I think, represents good, accurate color. And in this case, I would probably aim more for accuracy than warming things up artificially, so to speak, because these are natural objects and I want to have pretty natural colors for them. But again, just going through all of those values and making sure that the color is as accurate as possible. You might notice we have a pop-up on the properties panel for color balance, midtones versus shadows or highlights. Generally speaking, I would say that your best bet is, by and large, to work on midtones and midtones alone. If you think that you want to adjust only the shadows, let's go take a look at just the shadows. You'll notice that the adjustment is strong for the shadows, is mostly affecting the shadows, but it's still affecting the rest of the image to some extent. And basically what it boils down to is that in my mind, the shadows versus midtones versus highlights control for color balance does not give me an adequate degree of control over the specific tonal range I'm affecting. So if this is something you want to do, I would recommend that instead of using color balance, that you move to curves, which we'll take a look at shortly as well. All right, moving right along, my favorite adjustment when it comes to color is probably the vibrance adjustment. Like most photographers, I appreciate nice, highly saturated colors, not overly saturated, but colors that have a nice impact. They can just be very, very pleasing. And for that adjustment, when I'm trying to boost the colors, generally speaking, I find that the vibrance adjustment provides the best solution, in part because vibrance has some built-in self-control. So let's go ahead and add a vibrance adjustment layer. The same process as with all of the other adjustment layers. I'll click the button to add an adjustment layer and then choose vibrance from that pop-up list, and that will add a vibrance adjustment layer and, more importantly perhaps, give me the adjustment controls on the properties panel. Now the saturation slider, we saw saturation earlier when we were talking about evaluating colors in an image. The saturation slider in vibrance is not the same as the saturation slider in the hue saturation adjustment. The saturation slider here has got a little bit of self-control built in. It's not going to have as dramatic an effect. As you can see here, I've applied a very strong saturation adjustment, and I'm not getting those artificial, almost cartoonish colors that we were seeing with the earlier image. But we are affecting all of the colors. It's a little bit hard to see unless you're looking very closely, but if we pay attention carefully with the saturation adjustment, we'll start with a low value. The yellows are saturated, but they're not fully saturated yet, and the blues in the sky are a little bit drab. If I drag that saturation slider over toward the right, you'll see that the yellows are getting a boost and the sky is getting a boost. We're seeing some colors in the clouds getting a boost as well. The vibrance slider has a different control. It has a variable effect in that if we increase the value for vibrance, we're going to have, in this particular case, a stronger effect on the sky than we will have for the flowers, because the vibrance adjustment increases saturation. If you're using a positive value, it increases saturation for the colors that are not very saturated more than it does for the colors that are already saturated. And so you can boost the colors that need it without making the already saturated colors look problematic. In other words, it's got some built-in variability that can be extremely beneficial in terms of boosting the overall saturation for your image. I'll add as a side note, if you photograph people at all, the vibrance adjustment also has some self-control as it relates to skin tones. It will mitigate the effect. It will reduce the effect of that saturation boost with the vibrance slider when it comes to skin tone. So you can increase vibrance without creating kind of artificial colors, weird color effects in those skin tones. So it's essentially automatically protecting skin tones, which can be absolutely wonderful. In many cases, what I'll do, I'll exaggerate the effect here, but I'll boost the vibrance so that I'm bringing up, in this case, the blues so that they better match the overall saturation of the yellows. But then if I decide that the final effect is a little bit too strong, then I'll just reduce the saturation value. So I can boost the vibrance and in order to bring up the colors that need a little extra help. But then if that creates a result where the overall image is too saturated, then I can simply reduce the saturation value, the saturation slider at a negative value. And of course, it is entirely possible to use a negative value for the vibrance slider as well. And you'll see that we have a variable effect there to some extent as well. So we're not completely removing the color from the image in any event. So generally speaking, I would say for most photographers, I would use a positive value only for vibrance if you want to reduce saturation. Generally, I would just use a negative value for the saturation slider, or even using a lesser adjustment for saturation with the hue saturation adjustment. But the bottom line is that the vibrance adjustment with its built-in variability and self-control can be a wonderful tool for optimizing color in your images. For boosting the colors, I suppose I should say, but I would venture to guess that for many images, boosting those colors does indeed fall under the category of optimizing. So hue saturation is another really great control. A lot of photographers I found, I'll go ahead and just add a hue saturation adjustment. A lot of photographers I think might have given up on hue saturation because when you boost the saturation, colors get problematic really quickly. So better to use vibrance. And that might lead you to assume that with vibrance, we no longer need the hue saturation adjustment. But in fact, the hue saturation adjustment can be tremendously helpful for adjusting individual colors in the photo. So I'll bring that saturation back down. Let's just set that back to a 0 value. I could shift the hue, and then the image just gets weird. Now, this might be interesting from a creative standpoint, but for a normal photographic image, it would be problematic. So again, just reinforcing the notion that maybe we don't need hue saturation after all. But that's only when it relates to the master channel, meaning that we're working on all of the colors all at the same time. So if we boost saturation, we're affecting saturation for the entire image, for every single color in the photo. But what if I just want to affect certain colors? Let's take a look at maybe the yellows, so that we can adjust the yellows in this airplane. And maybe I want to boost the saturation of the yellows, or reduce the saturation of the yellows, or maybe even shift the color of just the yellows. Now, would I make the yellows of the airplane turn pink? Probably not. I certainly could, and there are certainly scenarios where you might want to do something like this. Notice, of course, that the yellows are found not only in the airplane, but also in the fields on the hills down below. And so you need to be careful with this technique, making sure that you're affecting only the area of the image that you actually want to affect, because we're focusing our adjustment here based on actual color values, not based on where those colors appear in the image. So if I've chosen the yellows, I might take a very small adjustment in hue. So something like this, if I want to make it just a little bit more of an orangish color, or if I want to take those yellows and make them a little bit more toward kind of a greenish type of a yellow. But the idea is that I'm essentially applying a color balance adjustment by using hue, a color balance adjustment for just the yellows. Or I can boost the saturation or tone down the saturation for just the yellows. I'll go ahead and turn off that adjustment and turn it back on again. So now in this case, essentially taking a yellow that was a little bit orange and shifting it to, in theory at least, a little bit more of a pure yellow. Maybe right about there is a little bit more accurate. But the point is that we can use hue saturation to define a specific range of colors. Now this is helpful when it comes to adjusting individual colors, to shifting the balance, for example, of individual colors. But it's also tremendously helpful when it comes to fixing color problems. So let's take a look at an example of that. I'll open up this image here, and I would like to adjust the colors. There's some magentas off in the distance here that I would like to tone down a little bit, and hue saturation works very well for that. I'll go ahead and add a hue saturation adjustment. First off, if I boost the colors significantly all the way to their maximum values, I can see that there are magentas in the background back here that look a little problematic to me. There's yellow and green in the water, and there's some oranges and reds and yellows throughout the rocks here. The sky is mostly blue, little hint of purple. So I think the only problem colors are those magentas. So again, using that saturation boost to help evaluate the colors in the image. And then I can go to the, for example, magentas, and crank up the saturation, and let's see, did I get all of the range of values? I'm not sure that I've got everything there. I guess maybe magentas is not quite covering exactly what I want it to cover. Well, I can change the definition of what magenta in this case actually means. If you take a look at the properties panel at the bottom right here and at the bottom of the properties panel, you'll see a visual indication of the range of colors that are being impacted by my adjustment. The vertical bars identify the range of colors that are being completely affected by this adjustment. And then the shapes on the outside there, they're sort of trapezoid shapes, that defines the range of transition between the colors being affected versus not being affected. I can move each of these little controls independently of one another. I can shift one at a time, but I can also shift the overall construct by clicking at the very center and dragging, or I can shift the outer boundaries, essentially, the effect, the balance of where I'm affecting versus not affecting, and then the transition. I can keep that transition by dragging on the transition. So I'll click in between those two shapes, and I can drag that whole shape outward so that I'm taking the entire adjustment to affect more colors, but maintaining that transition between areas being adjusted versus not adjusted. Maybe in this case I actually want to tighten things up so that I'm not getting as much effect in some of these reds in the rocks. Maybe I'll take this over just a little bit further, right about there, looks pretty good. And then maybe I'll expand into some more of the kind of purpley blue colors. I will start to affect the sky a little bit, but in this case my plan is to reduce saturation, and I'm not really worried about reducing saturation in the sky because the sky is pretty gray to begin with. So now I've customized the range of values. I've essentially changed the definition of magenta in the context of Photoshop so that I can then fine-tune the effect for those specific colors. Now I'll bring my saturation back down, and in this case, conceptually, I would want to reduce saturation, but not completely. I'll zoom in on this area, and we can see if I completely reduce the saturation, now those rocks are starting to look kind of gray. I don't want that. I just want the magenta to be toned down. So here we were initially, and I just want to tone that down maybe to right about there. Looks pretty good, where we're just reducing the intensity of that magenta. It's a subtle difference, to be sure, but these are exactly the types of subtle changes that I think are important in terms of truly optimizing the appearance of a photo. By focusing in on these smaller details in terms of color, same thing would apply for tonal adjustments as well, but I'm really then taking the image to that next level as I refine more and more, looking at finer and finer details within the photo and really trying to make the most of the colors in the image. That really can make a tremendous difference in the overall quality of your photos. Now, I mentioned curves for color, and I want to show you just briefly, give you a basic concept here in terms of how it works. You might already be familiar with the curves adjustment. The curves adjustment is generally thought of as a tonal adjustment, and as a tonal adjustment, it is very, very powerful. But we can also use the curves adjustment to adjust the color in our photos. So I'm going to add a curves adjustment, and by default, of course, that curves adjustment affects the tonality in the image, but that's because we're working on the RGB channel. We can also work on the individual red, green, and blue channels. So in this case, the image is very, very blue, so the strongest effect will be with the blue channel. Let's go ahead and focus our attention there. I'll choose the blue channel, and now instead of brightening or darkening the image, I'm brightening or darkening the blue channel. And so I can shift just the blues of the image. Brightening or darkening the blue channel shifts the color more toward blue or less toward blue, if you will, meaning more toward the opposite color, which would be yellow. And let's assume, for example, that you want to bring out a little more of the natural tones in the foreground. You want the shadows to be a little bit more yellow, a little bit less blue. Then you might want to shift toward a yellow value. You can see we start to get a little more natural colors in these dark areas of the photo. The problem is that we're taking those bright areas of the image and making them yellow, and it just looks a little odd. To me, I think with a relatively neutral value, a relatively almost slightly bluish tone for the Duomo here, the cathedral, I think that works very well. It helps that building really stand out. But I think I might like to tone down the blues just a little bit for the shadows. So instead of just dragging at the center of the curve, I'll take that anchor point down toward the left, down toward the shadow values, and I'll drag that curve downward, and I'm just going to apply a very strong adjustment so that we'll see a more obvious effect in the photo. I'll take the anchor point downward. Now I've focused my adjustment on the shadows, but I've pulled down the entire curve. So I'm applying a shift toward yellow, but it's affecting the entire image, all tonalities. And so I want to balance that out. I want to not affect the bright areas. Well, I can add an additional anchor point on this curve. I'm going to go up toward the very bright areas, and I'll once again exaggerate the effect. I'll take those white areas, the brighter areas, toward more of a blue effect, and I'll bring this other anchor point for the shadows down. Now, this obviously is a bit of an extreme effect in terms of the shadows getting very, very yellow, you might say, or really more subtracting the blue versus taking, well, essentially leaving the blue in the highlights. In other words, this is an extreme example of this adjustment possibility, but if we mitigate that a little bit, then we'll see that we're able to have the shadows be not quite so blue while retaining the existing color in the highlights. And so generally I would use very subtle adjustments for this type of technique, but the point is that I can adjust the highlights and the shadows independently. So I can shift the color balance for the shadows in one direction, for the highlights in another direction. Or I can just shift the shadows in one direction and leave the highlights as they were. I can focus on the midtones. Again, we can emphasize our adjustment in specific tonal ranges within the photo. And so to me, this is just like the most powerful possibility when it comes to color balance, because we're able to exercise great control over specific tonal ranges within the photo. Of course, in some situations, we actually don't necessarily want to affect only the certain colors in the photo. We don't want to just affect the shadows and make them more yellow, or just the highlights and make them more blue. Sometimes we need to adjust the color in a way that needs to be targeted. In other words, we want to apply an adjustment based on geography in the photo, not just based on color values in the photo. So let's assume, for example, that I would like to fine-tune the colors in the foreground. I want to boost maybe the saturation, for example. I might use vibrance for that. But let's take a look. If I boost the saturation, ignoring the vibrance possibility at the moment, if I'm affecting the yellows, maybe I also want to shift those yellows to make them look just a little bit more kind of a little goldeny yellow kind of a color, maybe somewhere in there. That might be a good result for the individual yellows, but you can see the sky is being affected. We have a lot of blues in the sky that are being exaggerated as well, maybe shifted. So in some situations, you'll want to apply an adjustment based not on color values necessarily. Obviously, in this particular image, color values would work as a great way of identifying specific colors, but the point is that we can use the area of the photo to define that as well. I'll go ahead and just get rid of my hue saturation adjustment in this case, and then I can use a selection. So just as a basic introduction to targeted adjustments, we'll create a selection here. I'm going to use the quick selection tool. I'll increase that brush size just a little bit, and I'm just going to paint across the sky. In this case, so that I can apply an adjustment to the sky, maybe I want to reduce the overall saturation for just the sky. So with that selection active, I can add a different type of adjustment. In this case, maybe I'll just use hue saturation, since this is a very simple reduction in saturation. I don't want those blues in the sky, so I'm going to take that saturation down a little bit just to help make sure that I have a good neutral value for the sky. I could also create a selection for the foreground. So we were talking about adjusting that foreground area. I'll use the quick selection tool to create a selection of that area. I could certainly just reload my existing selection and invert it, for example, but I'll go ahead and just create a selection of the foreground, since it's, in this case, a pretty simple selection to create. And then I'll add an additional adjustment, maybe in this case a vibrance adjustment, for example, and I might boost the colors just a little, maybe right about there. Looks to be pretty good. I'll turn that adjustment off and then on again. You can see I'm just boosting the yellows, the overall saturation for those yellows just a little bit, and bringing up the green undertones as well, so that we've got just a little bit more color. But again, what I'm really doing is focusing those adjustments on specific geographic areas of the photo. So I can adjust only the sky by selecting the sky and adding an adjustment layer. That adjustment layer will then have what's called a layer mask, so that the sky is defined as white on the layer mask versus black for the foreground area. Or for my foreground adjustment, white defines the area to be adjusted, the foreground in this case, and then black is defining the sky, the area that will not be adjusted. Alrighty, so let's take a few questions from our audience here. We've got a few questions that have been coming up during the presentation. So the first question here, are you adding noise to the photo when you use the vibrance adjustment? That's an excellent question. The answer is technically no. I'm not adding noise when I'm boosting the saturation or the vibrance in the image. However, I might be exaggerating the color noise. So color noise is usually very highly saturated to begin with. So in general, you're going to find that the impact is not terribly significant, but anything that's going to enhance the noise can certainly be problematic. And so when we're applying a boost to the saturation, you do want to pay attention to noise in the image. And so with that, you'll then optimize the noise first. When noise is a concern, try to reduce that noise as much as possible. Then when you're boosting the colors, because you could potentially be also boosting the color of the noise, you want to pay careful attention. Maybe you will not increase the saturation as much as you otherwise would have, or maybe that means you need to revisit noise reduction and maybe apply a little bit stronger effect. Generally speaking, we can do a pretty good job of getting rid of color noise almost in its entirety. And so usually reduce color noise enough where boosting the saturation is not problematic, but it is an issue to be aware of. I see there was also a question about using the color checker passport for camera calibration in Lightroom, and yes, indeed. So I mentioned that Hunts is offering as a sponsor of today's webinar. I'll show you those links again. I know they've been pasted into the chat as well. The code that you can use to get the discount on the x-rite color checker passport. And yes, indeed, it can be very helpful for achieving accurate color. And in fact, Next month, in March, we're going to be presenting on the topic of using tools such as the Color Checker Passport to optimize the color. It's especially helpful because really what we're accomplishing with a product like the Color Checker Passport is what I would refer to as accurate color. In other words, we're taking our photo and making it appear as though it had been illuminated by perfectly white light. Now, it might seem like that's not necessarily your goal. For example, with outdoor photography, we go out at late afternoon light, we want that golden light. But even in those types of situations, it can be helpful to achieve neutral color values for the image as a starting point. So it's a very common approach with video, for example, to achieve a perfectly neutral video capture and then introduce a color adjustment. And a similar approach can actually be very helpful when it comes to still images also. So similar adjustments, the question here is, can you do similar adjustments, apply similar adjustments using Lightroom as we saw today in Photoshop? And the answer is yes, indeed. Many of the same adjustments that are available in Photoshop are also available in Lightroom, and in fact, by extension, in Adobe Camera Raw. So if you prefer, you could use Adobe Camera Raw to optimize many attributes of your color, and that includes, I'll go ahead and actually bring up a raw capture so that we can look at that. So if I open up a raw capture, it opens in Adobe Camera Raw, and you'll see that we have temperature and tint. That's essentially our color balance adjustment. We have vibrance and saturation, which enables us to, of course, as we've already seen, adjust the overall vibrance and saturation within the image. But these are just part of the adjustments. We also have a tone curve where we can actually use the parametric option, the point option, and then adjust individual colors. So we have that same ability that we saw with curves. Of course, in detail, I mentioned noise reduction, and that can certainly be something that you want to take a look at. And then HSL grayscale, we were looking at the ability to use hue and saturation to affect individual colors in an image in a couple of different contexts, and we can apply the same basic result. Now, in Adobe Camera Raw or in Lightroom, we do not have the ability to change the definition of the individual colors, as we saw that we were able to do with hue saturation, but we can indeed adjust the hues individually for the various color values. So we were looking at an image where I wanted to change the values for the purples and magentas, for example. Well, I can go to the saturation tab and reduce the saturation for the purples. Since this image doesn't really have much of that, I'll reduce the saturation for yellows so that we can see we're able to focus our adjustment on the yellows. These yellows have a little bit of orange in them, so we'll reduce the value for orange as well. Same concept as hue saturation, the main difference in this case being that I'm not able to actually change the definition of what is yellow or what is orange. I can only work with the individual sliders. So then a question about the products that I mentioned. I'll bring up those codes here real quick just so that you can jot those down if you didn't already, or again, look in the chat and you'll find links directly that have the codes essentially built in, so you can just follow the link and get these discounts automatically, courtesy of Hunt's Photo and Video. So look for those links in the chat. But the question is, what's the difference between the Color Checker Passport and the Color Monkey display? Well, the difference is one is affecting your monitor display. So the Color Monkey display is for calibrating your overall monitor display. So calibrating and profiling your monitor display so that what you're seeing on your computer's display is accurate. The Color Checker Passport is, you can think of this as a very sophisticated gray card. So we're all familiar with the concept of using a gray card to establish a neutral gray in an image. It can also obviously be used for setting exposure in an image. The Color Checker Passport is very similar. It's a portable device. It's very small. It fits in your pocket. It folds into, it's basically a case that you can open up and has these various color swatches as well as shades of gray, etc. And you can use that. You basically take a picture with that device in the frame, and then you can use that as the basis of applying very sophisticated adjustments later. And so one, the Color Checker Passport is for optimizing the color in your original capture, and it's really a tool that you use in post-processing, but you take a picture that includes the Color Checker Passport, and the Color Monkey display is for correcting the appearance of your monitor display. So when you're on location, to use the Passport as one of your first shots so you can have a place to start. So yes, that's exactly the idea with the Color Checker Passport, is that we're able to take a picture that includes. So let's assume a very simple scenario. The question here asked if we use that in your first shot. Maybe, but that assumes that the light's not. So the idea is that we're able to compensate for the color of light in a relatively automatic way using the color checker passport. And so you would take a picture under the same lighting conditions as your subject. So let's just assume a simple situation where we're in a fixed environment. The light's not going to change. I'm photographing a subject. I can take a photo with the color checker passport held up near that subject and then remove that color checker passport from the frame and continue taking pictures. And then I'm able to optimize the images that were taken without the color checker passport using the image that includes the color checker passport. Then another question, really good question, do you use the histogram to make decisions about color? And I would say to some extent yes, but generally I find that that's not especially helpful. Let's go ahead and just bring up an image here, and if we take a look at the histogram for this image, I'll pull up the histogram panel here inside of Photoshop, we can make certain evaluations about the color based on this histogram. So I can see, for example, a spike on the blue channels in the shadows, and a spike, this obviously would be the sky. There's lots and lots of bright blue values, and I've got a pretty even distribution of yellows and reds. So I can make some decisions evaluating the color based on the histogram, but quite frankly, it gets to be a little bit challenging trying to interpret the interplay of all of these individual channels when I could essentially just as easily, or I would say more easily, boost the saturation and get a better sense of what those colors are doing within the image in any event. And so I would say that yes, the histogram can be helpful if you're able to understand how to interpret it when it comes to color. The histogram's a little bit more helpful when it comes to tonal decisions about the tonal values in the image. But that said, we can also see, for example, if we've clipped an individual color on that histogram, then that would indicate that we're losing detail in one of those colors. So still useful to evaluate the histogram overall, both in terms of individual colors and obviously in terms of the overall brightness values in the photo. So another question from one of the attendees. Let's see. I work in a room that is quite bright, daylight, dirty windows. I guess the dirty windows are helping to tone down the brightness just a little bit in daytime, and then lit by incandescent light at night. How do I control color on the monitors at different times of day? Well, you have a couple of options here. My personal preference is to try, to the best of my ability, to work under very consistent lighting conditions, ideally in a relatively darkened room, so that I know that I'm going to be only focused, I'm only really going to be viewing the actual light, the color that is being emitted by my monitor display. So ideally, a relatively dark room. Sometimes that's not practical, sometimes that's not possible, so I try as best I can. Then the question is, how do you compensate for that? Well, you can just accept that your eye adjusts in terms of exposure and color and try to trust that. But also the ColorMonkey display, many of the monitor calibration tools that are available today, including the ColorMonkey display, enable you, I'll bring up those codes again, and I know they've been pasted into the chat as well, but just to make sure, the ColorMonkey display enables you to have that display, your display, automatically changed based on changing lighting conditions. And so you can enable the option where it's actually using the colorimeter device to evaluate the current conditions in your room and adjust automatically. Some displays also have an option in terms of adjusting the overall brightness and even the contrast, and so you have the option in many cases to have that automatically adjust. This is more common in laptops than it is with desktop displays, but a more accurate way to accomplish that would be with something like the ColorMonkey display to take advantage of that automatic adjustment. I tend to prefer not to have an automatic adjustment. I don't like when things are changing right before my eyes, and so I try to just make sure that I'm in a more stable environment in terms of lighting whenever possible. And then one last question before we close out today's webinar. Is there an easy way to determine if the screen is too bright? Well, for starters, I might say that you can probably assume that if you've never calibrated your display, it probably is too bright. But when you do calibrate the display, that's one of the key things. It's one of the primary reasons to calibrate is the luminance, the overall brightness of your display. Obviously, color is a big focus when we're calibrating our monitor displays, but luminance is also an issue as well. And a product such as the ColorMonkey display is actually going to measure the luminance. It measures it, generally presented candelas per square meter, and you can define your target value, and it will tell you just how bright that display is, and then you can adjust accordingly. And it used to be, I would describe the process of monitor calibration as being two steps. Calibration, where you change the settings for your actual display, and profiling, where the colorimeter is reading the individual values, and then you're building a profile, the software is building a profile, and setting that as the profile in order to compensate for the appearance of the display. And so that used to be a two-step process. It can be a two-step process, but with today's software, x-rite software now can actually handle all of that for you automatically. In most cases, it depends on your computer configuration, but generally it can automatically adjust that luminance for you, making it even easier to go through that process. And it really does. The software does guide you step by step through the entire process of calibrating and profiling and making sure that you're getting an accurate display. And then, of course, with all that you've learned today in the webinar, you'll be able to make sure that you're getting the most accurate color. So by calibrating your display, you're seeing accurate color, and then with the techniques that you've learned today, hopefully that will get you better equipped and more confident in your ability to apply those color adjustments to really optimize the colors in your photos. I want to thank you again for attending today. Thank you to x-rite for hosting the webinar, and to Hunt's Photo and Video for sponsoring today's webinar and offering those special discounts on the ColorMonkey display as well as a Color Checker Passport. In addition, if you'd like to learn more, if you'd like to see some of my training videos, we have a library, the Gray Learning Video Training Library, and there is an everything bundle that includes all of the video courses that we've produced. I think we're up to, it's somewhere around 40 courses, give or take, that we've published, and more are in production all the time. We also have a digital magazine for photographers that's included in this bundle, and a lot more. So if you'd like to learn more about Photoshop, Lightroom, photography, or anything that relates to those topics, the Gray Learning Everything bundle has everything that we publish, that I publish myself, and you can get a $50 discount by following the link shown here, timgray.me/xritegray. So check out the Gray Learning Everything bundle. Be sure to check out those discounts offered from Hunt's. And thank you again for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you on a future webinar.